Blake and I really wanted to go through a little bit around parasport. We'll touch on disability sport today as well, and I think that's a really important distinction, which I'm happy to chat a little bit more about. I'm happy to chat about it at length, but we'll touch on it a little bit today. But we'll focus a lot onto classification because it's a real cornerstone of parasport and how it works. But we want to talk about why it's important for success, and we thought we'd use the QAS, the Queensland Academy of Sport Para Unit, as an opportunity to talk you through about how classification plays a role, but also what we're doing at the QAS to find and develop the next generation of Paralympians. So I guess we'll start a little bit with why this is important. I'm not sure if anyone's heard, but there's a pretty exciting opportunity for Brisbane in 2032. Of course, we have the Olympic and Paralympic Games gracing us in 2032, and the Paralympic Games is the third biggest sporting event in the world, following the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup. The opportunity that this presents Brisbane and Australia and Oceania more broadly cannot be understated, or cannot be overstated, actually. It's an incredible opportunity, but we need to make sure that we make the most of it. And a big part of what that looks like is, one, doing really, really well in Brisbane 2032, but also leaving a legacy or having an impact on sport, physical activity, recreation, and leisure for people with a disability, things that I'm incredibly passionate about. So when we talk about what the best games ever might look like from a Paralympic Games perspective, it's important to reflect on where we've come from. So our best games ever was actually Sydney. So Sydney 2000 was a bit of a turning point for Paralympic sport in Australia. We started to get Paralympians who became household names. So Kurt Fearnley and Louise Savage. And in the decades that followed, Paralympic sport gained a lot of traction. So we increased our numbers of participation. We've come to know and love our Paralympians and really understand what it means to be the best in the world for someone with an eligible impairment. But if we want to really succeed in 2032, what best games ever would look like is beating Sydney, essentially, because we have been sliding across the Paralympic medal tally for essentially the last 24 years. So what would best games ever look like? It would look like a team size of about 300 athletes, winning about 150 medals. And when you look at what happened in Paris, we did incredibly well, especially in Queensland. But there's a huge gap, and this presents both a challenge but also an opportunity. And what I've got on this slide is actually, and some of you will have definitely seen this before, but what you'll see in the navy coloured sort of triangle pyramid shape there in the middle is essentially what you might be familiar with from both a grassroots and a high performance type sport environment. So this is particularly relating to high performance, but for those of you who are more involved in grassroots recreation and sport, you can imagine this to be true for any sort of grassroots sports organisation. You've always got a bigger base of a pyramid where there's a lot of people coming through, and as you move towards high performance, so podium is the top of that navy pyramid for Olympic athletes, but you've got a smaller amount of people winning medals. This is true for all sport. We know we've got a big base. Lots of people might do it socially. A lot of people will want to go towards high performance, and we'll have a lot of developing and emerging athletes, and they move towards that podium at the top. We need that pipeline or that pathway to look the same for Paralympic athletes as well, to have our best games ever in 2032, but it currently doesn't look like that. So if you look at the teal coloured pyramid in the middle of the navy pyramid, you'll actually see our Paralympic pathway is inverted. And what I mean by that is we've got some incredible winning medalists in Paralympic sport across many, many sports in Australia, but we have a really small currently number of athletes in that developing and emerging space. And they're the athletes we think will win medals in LA and Brisbane. So you can start to see the problem. We've got a lot of athletes, we've got a reasonable number of athletes at a podium level, but our grassroots and our developing and emerging athletes is where our biggest challenge is. And that's the thing that we really want to overcome as we move towards Brisbane 2032. And why is that? Some of this will come as absolutely no surprise to many of you. The AIS and the ASC actually did a big survey, and it was reasonably well responded to. And surveys, we know that can be really tough, but we got a lot of responses. But the barriers were clear. It identified more than 160 barriers to entry and progression into para sport. And there were some really key ones, and that a lot of them relate to the sort of 6 on the bottom left of the slide, and that's classification, it's coaching, it's training environments, both facilities but also expertise and things that what that would look like. It's paraliteracy of leadership and people who make decisions around resourcing and funding. It's access to competition, and it's accessibility, particularly for athletes with high support needs. And I come into this presentation with a real bias around athletes with high support needs and opportunities to provide sports, leisure and recreation for people who do have more severe disabilities. So I will talk a little bit about that today as well. So some of the really key ones when you really narrow it down are environments for training, coaching and classification. And I'll talk a little bit about classification because it really is a cornerstone of Paralympic sport. But I'll start quite broad, and I want you all to think about what sport looks like for anyone, whether you're someone with a disability or someone without a disability. And when you think about who has an advantage in sport, there are some key things that will determine performance or high performance, particularly in sports that are determined by strength and power. So it differs a little bit when you're thinking about target sports, but if we're thinking about sports that are primarily determined by strength and power, the people that have an advantage in competitive sport, whether you've got a disability or not, is things like body size, age, physical maturity, and also no injury, no impairments, and those sorts of things. So when we think about classification actually already exists in Olympic sport as well. We think about it being something that's primarily related to Paralympic sport, but classification exists in all forms of sport. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the 100 meters at the Olympic Games, we don't run men and women together because there are things that are related to, and this is incredibly contentious even in Olympic sport, but there's things that are related to strength and power. That means that we separate athletes into different competitions or classifications for high performance sport in Olympics. We do it for rowing and sports like weightlifting and boxing and wrestling and that sort of thing as well, because one of the primary determinants of performance in these sports is body size. So we actually create classifications or classes for athletes of different body size. We've got masters competitions in sport because we know as we get older, our performance declines. So these are the things that impact on performance. But in Paralympic sport, the thing that has the greatest impact on performance is usually impairment. So that's essentially our unit of classification. When we think about classification in Paralympic sport, the aim is to minimise the impact that that impairment has on sports performance. So you group athletes together based on how much their impairment impacts their performance. It's not an exact science, but it is the fundamental cornerstone of Paralympic sport. And the reason it becomes so important is because that's how we determine who's the best in the world. So without a class, it's really hard to understand whether someone's talented or not in Paralympic sport. And I'll touch on this a little bit later on as well. But something I want to make really, really clear is that we've got a list of eligible impairments for Paralympic sport, and it's not everything. So not every person with a disability is eligible for Paralympic sport. And this can be quite confronting for people, and it can be seen as unfair. But this is the list of eligible impairments. So we've got limb deficiency or loss of limbs, we've got muscle weakness, and that's usually for conditions like spinal cord injuries. Coordination impairments are from things like cerebral palsy, which was one of the largest childhood disabilities. Restricted joint movement might be something like arthrogryposis or someone who's had a fixed joint. We've got athletes like with short stature, so achondroplastic dwarfism, leg length difference, intellectual impairment and vision impairment. We understand that there are a lot of disabilities that don't fit into that list. So people talk about functional neurological conditions, or they talk about chronic pain, they talk about cystic fibrosis. We understand that these disabilities impact on people's sport performance, but there's no pathway for those particular athletes in Paralympic sport. And I guess the message is that this is not necessarily a bad thing. The Paralympics is an incredible, incredible sports movement for people with a disability, and it encompasses many, many people with disabilities, but it's not everyone. But there are other sports opportunities for people in disability sport that create competitive, meaningful opportunities for people. So Invictus Games is primarily for veterans, but their classification system actually caters for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Paralympic sport doesn't cater for that. The Virtus Global Games, which is, we were talking before the webinar started, the Virtus has actually got a championships in Brisbane on at the moment. And one of the things that I love about the Virtus Games is that they actually have multiple classes for people with intellectual impairments, and they have a class for people with autism, and they have a class for people who have an intellectual and physical disability combined. That's an incredible sports opportunity for athletes who don't fit into traditional Paralympic pathways. So if you look at Paralympic sport, athletes with intellectual impairments only can participate in 3 sports: athletics, swimming, and table tennis. And there's only one class. So that really does narrow the competitive field for people with intellectual impairments. So I often, when parents and children come to me, I often promote Virtus as an incredible opportunity to represent Australia on the world stage, just in a different sports competition. The reason I've got the World Dwarf Games up there as well is will become a little bit clearer when we look at some of the events on offer in Paralympic sport, because when you look at a sport like athletics, it covers every impairment, eligible impairment. I do have a slide for this, but what that means is if you have every eligible impairment in athletics and you have 100, 200, 400, 800, 1500, long jump, high jump, triple jump, shot put, discus, javelin, all of a sudden, if you had an event for every class existing in the Paralympic Games for every discipline, athletics on its own would go for 6 months. So they actually have to decide which events they'll put on offer for each different disability in each different class. So at the moment, if you are an athlete with short stature, there are athletics events for throwing, but there are no track events, so you can't run 100 metres. And I know lots of athletes with short stature that are incredible runners, but they won't ever get the opportunity to run at the Paralympic Games unless something drastic changes at an international level, which we can advocate for, but it's really unlikely to change in the short term. But we can prepare them for the World Dwarf Games, and Australia takes a team for that, and it's an incredible opportunity to promote running events for athletes with short stature. So who can participate? We talked a little bit about the eligible impairment types, but I wanted to make it clear, and some of this would be self-explanatory, but not every eligible impairment type competes in every sport. So some sports are actually for single impairments. So for goalball, which is actually an incredible sport, I'm a big fan of goalball, it's only for athletes with a vision impairment, as is five-a-side football. So you can only participate in that at the Paralympic Games if you have a vision impairment. Whereas sports like, let's say, para taekwondo cater for loss of limbs, muscle weakness, and restricted joint movement, but they don't actually cater for athletes with cerebral palsy at the moment or coordination impairments. So when we talk about messaging and we talk about inclusion and we talk about making sure that people are on the right pathway to parasport, it is really important to understand who might be eligible and what type of opportunities might be available for them at the elite level. When we talk about grassroots sports, there are huge opportunities to be inclusive and get people involved in sport. But I think this is really important because we don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. And I've had kids, so let's example, an athlete with short stature goes to a come and try day, falls in love with wheelchair basketball, and then finds out 6 months later after training really, really hard that short stature is not an eligible impairment type for wheelchair basketball at the Paralympic Games. It's just important that as we move towards Brisbane 2032, that everyone's on the same page with messaging and making sure that we're really structured about pathways and opportunities for people to participate, but also to represent Australia on the world stage. This is to give you a little bit of a sense. Actually, I'm going to use Blake's. Blake redid this slide for me, and it's much better than mine, so thank you, Blake. But what it does give you a sense of is where the medals can be won at a Paralympic Games. So this is particularly for the LA cycle. So we've got 23 different sports with a total of 560 medal events on offer. If you know anything about Olympic sport, I think, and Blake might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 349 medal events on the Olympic program. So there's actually more medals on offer at the Paralympic Games. And there's a bit of a breakdown there in terms of whether they're physical impairments, which is what 85% of the medals on offer are. There's a number of 10%, 11% for blind and low vision, and 4% for intellectual impairments. But if you look at the sheer number of medals, para-athletics, para-swimming and para-cycling, and I think with table tennis, gives you basically about nearly 70% of the medals on offer. So when we think about pathways, we really do need to be quite deliberate about sports and opportunities for athletes. That doesn't make any of the other sports on that list less important, because choice is incredibly important when we think about pathways for para-athletes. And we want to strengthen pathways at both the grassroots and a high performance level in all of these sports, but also in other sports that are emerging. So we know that power chair football's got a Asia Pacific Oceania, I think I've gotten that title wrong, but you can Google it. It's on this week in Brisbane at Nissan Arena, which if anyone's interested and you're in Brisbane, you should definitely check it out, because it's an incredible display of athleticism for athletes who use a powered wheelchair for mobility and for sport. It's worth mentioning that when we talk about classification, I called it sort of the cornerstone or fundamental piece of parasport. And it is important when we start to have good conversations about classification, we start to think about the fact that it's different across the sports. So in team sports like wheelchair basketball, you're allocated, for example, and wheelchair rugby, you're allocated a point. So you might be a 3.5 player, you might be a 0.5 player, and it's to some extent that's saying how much your impairment impacts on sport performance. It's not so that you can compete only with 0.5s or 3.5s, but 8 points are then allowed in wheelchair rugby on the court at any one time with the players. So coaching then becomes a real art of making sure that you've got the right players in the right lineups at the right time. Whereas team sports like ice sled hockey actually only have minimum impairment criteria. So you can get into ice sled hockey if you're missing, I think it's half a foot from a limb deficiency perspective, and then and as soon as you meet eligibility criteria, it doesn't really matter how severe your impairment is. Everyone plays together. That's got pros and cons, but it does really change the dynamic of the sport. Team sports like goalball and individual sports like in athletics, you have athletes with conditions like cerebral palsy competing with athletes with conditions like cerebral palsy. When you look at an individual sport like swimming, and Blake would be much better about talking to this, but some of the classes you can have an athlete with short stature, an athlete with a limb deficiency, and an athlete with a spinal cord injury and cerebral palsy all in the same race. So their classification systems have evolved differently. They all need to adhere to the IPC classification code, but because of the way that they've developed, there's nuances between them that when you're promoting entry into parasport, I think it's important to be aware of. And this is essentially my effort of talking a little bit about why classification is so essential for talent identification and ultimately development. So these are quite old athletes now. Some of you might recognise Kurt Fearnley on the right of the slide, and Fabian Blattman's the athlete on the left. And essentially, if we were just to look at the times that I've put at the bottom of the slide, and I asked you who was the best athlete, if you were looking at that from a time perspective, knowing that usually in a race, faster is better, you might automatically assume that Kurt was a better athlete. However, in wheelchair racing, we've actually got 4 different classes. So there's a T51, 52, 53, and 54. So Kurt is a T54 and Fabian is a T51. And what that means is they compete against other people who have similar impairments to them. So Fabian doesn't have tricep muscles because of the high level of his spinal cord injury, and it means he uses his biceps predominantly to propel his wheelchair, as do all athletes in the T51 class. So If you just looked at a time, so if you were looking at the Queensland state title results for multi-class athletes and you had a look and you went, oh, that must be a really talented young 15-year-old because she ran the fastest out of everyone in the multi-class race, without understanding the classification, there is no way of understanding talent. So I have a lot of parents coming to me saying, oh, Emma, I've got a son, he's got cerebral palsy, and he's going to be a Paralympic gold medal winner because he is almost as fast as all of the other people in his class that don't have a disability. Unfortunately, once we don't know whether that athlete is talented or not, because if the athlete's got reasonably mild cerebral palsy, they'll compete at the Paralympic Games against other athletes with really mild cerebral palsy, and that comparison to able-bodied athletes or even the people underneath them no longer matters. So without a good understanding of classification, it is incredibly hard to do talent ID. And some of you might be wondering why I've got a photo of an athlete from Sydney 2000 on this slide. And that's actually because that's the last time an athlete in that T51 class represented Australia. It is hard to get athletes with high support needs who have really significant impairments and more severe disabilities into sport. It's something that I'm really passionate about, but it is really tricky. And that it's telling that we haven't had a T51 racer in 24 years. And that leads me on to where I'm going to hand over to Blake. But essentially, I am passionate about athletes with high support needs. Power chair football's one of the pictures on the right there. And the bottom picture is a very young Dan Michelle, actually, but a boccia athlete who propels the ball towards a target-based game, which is boccia in Paralympic sport, with an aid. So he uses a ramp to play. It's a really strategic game. He's an incredible athlete and has won a Paralympic medal. But we need to increase our representation of athletes with high support needs in parasport, because even for people with disabilities, they may actually think that they don't have a place in parasport because they don't see themselves in our Paralympic team at the moment, because we don't field a lot of athletes in those classes for athletes with high support needs. It is also more difficult. We know that, and we need to break down some of those barriers. But I also want to change some attitudes. A lot of people will see people with high support needs playing sport and go, oh, that's lovely. That's participation. It's actually not. For athletes with high support needs who are at the top of their game worldwide, they are elite athletes. It might not look what you are familiar with from a high performance perspective, but it's important that we start to understand what high performance looks like in parasport. So I will leave it there. Blake, apologies if I've taken up a couple of your minutes, but I will. I'll let you go, and I'll be in charge of flicking through your slides.
Perfect, Emma. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. As it was mentioned, my name is Blake Cochrane. I'm the para unit lead here at the Queensland Academy of Sport, and I'm excited to, tell you a little bit more about how our program operates and some of the, dimensions that we are venturing into to try and create some opportunities for our athletes across sort of Queensland, but also sort of the wider Australia as well. Next, please, Emma. So the goal of the para unit across the country is to find more athletes to invert, the current inverted funnel that we do have and turn it into a little bit more of a pyramid structure. But the thing about the para unit is we're not trying to take over the current pathways that athletes can connect into Paralympic sport, but we're trying to, create a means and a mechanism that can act as an alternate source for connecting people to opportunities that sport has to offer. And so currently we're really trying to find athletes that aren't, currently connected to sporting pathways. We're trying to find those gems in the rough, and I'll share with you a quick story about one of those athletes that we have found so far, very early in his story and on his journey, but we're very excited to sort of see where things might go. But we play a really powerful piece in being able to connect different opportunities, but also currently for talent transfer as well. Within parasport, we have an athlete that might be retiring from their sport, or they might be in a position where their sport or impairment type doesn't quite match what they're trying to set out to perform or fit into a particular classification. And we can help facilitate finding the best possible sport for them. As mentioned, I wish I knew that I was eligible for wheelchair rugby a little bit earlier in my sporting journey. I grew up playing soccer for 11 years, which I just absolutely loved being a part of a team sport. And so part of the idea with the para unit is that we will be able to connect athletes to multiple different sporting opportunities, particularly in the early stages of their developmental career, finding them the sport that they may have the highest performance ceiling in. But as Emma mentioned, it's all about that athlete choice. We might be able to tell them that it's an easier road to potentially winning a gold medal, as easy as we can sell winning a gold medal at a Paralympic Games is. But also we do want to encourage them to pursue the sport that they're passionate about. But at least they can make an informed decision as where they may be the best fit. And then as discussed, there's also that element of finding athletes that are currently underrepresented in our pathway. We've mentioned that Australia has done incredibly well in the Sydney 2000 Paralympic Games, and we've actually done relatively well in the games that have followed, but particularly we've done well in athletes that have low support needs or have a minimalistic, impairment type, because they have been able to fit into mainstream programs really, really well. So it might be someone that has sort of congenital limb deficiency, maybe affecting their arm or their hands, like myself, but they're able to fit into mainstream programs really, really easily. It's considering those athletes that may have the higher support needs that don't quite fit into those mainstream systems, whether it's accessibility or whether it's safety, in considering that if we're thinking about canoe or rowing and we have a high support need athlete that may have limited balance, if that canoe rolls over on the river, we need to make sure that the supports are there to be able to make sure that person can exit their vessel, and making sure that they're safe in doing so. So there's a few considerations in place around that, and the para unit is a really great place to be able to support and train some of those athletes as they begin to develop as well. Thank you, Emma. So what is a para unit? I won't spend too much on this slide, but we're working with four main pillars. So we have the para unit, which is my main role, to look after up to 60 athletes and developing them and supporting them through our pathways to ultimately move them towards high performance sport. But we recognise that our role is so much bigger than that, and works beyond high performance sport and creating those social and sport connected opportunities for our communities as well. And so that's why we've really tried to establish the role of some of our coaches in being able to currently be supporting 15 coaches across 9 different sports to help develop the para coaching literacy across Queensland as a whole. We recognise we are very, very sparse in how we connect into regional communities as well. So we're trying to work on some of those plans for that as well. We have our Youth for 32 Talent Day, which is a day where we have athletes come along and do some performance testing, but they also get some information around what sports they may be eligible for. And then finally, probably the part that we're really looking to try and connect into with our communities is particularly around our affiliate network, that referral mechanism that is out there, trying to find athletes that may be eligible for Paralympic sport that have never really tapped into that sort of sporting space before. And it's a really, really interesting conversation about how do we create those opportunities for athletes and upskill our community to know a little bit more about the athletes that we're connecting into this space. And so allied health plays a really powerful plays a really important connection piece in being able to find and refer athletes to our system as well. But in saying that, anyone that is part of our community and meets athletes or is engaging with young people or engaging with people that have recently acquired their disabilities, it's educating them around those opportunities that we have for them and where they may be able to fit into our system as well. Thank you, Emma. So what does the para unit look like? Like all things, it's probably a little bit of a pyramid. Down the bottom is what I mentioned around that affiliate network, that connection piece from our community to be able to connect people into the opportunities of Paralympic sport. as their talent, I guess, becomes a little bit more known to us within the system, we start to move them through the pathways as to where they go. We have an incredible new app, which is the U for 32 Talent app that has, I guess, the endless opportunities of being able to allow athletes to test in the comfort of their own home. So although we love seeing and meeting athletes face to face, we also recognise creating some of those opportunities for those athletes that are in far north or central Queensland and being able to invite them along to some of our testing sessions. And so if an athlete jumps onto the app, records some data, we get to see it here in Brisbane, and we can actually pay and support their costs for them to travel to southeast Queensland, so we can create some opportunities for connecting some of those athletes as well. As they progress a little bit further through, they come to our testing day, we meet them in person, and then for those athletes that we see enough potential in, and relying on our coaches that are involved in the sports as well, we are then able to, I guess, bring them into the para unit where we can support the development of those athletes as they continue to thrive. Next slide, please, Emma. So for our athletes that are connecting into the piece, we recognise that there are really important opportunities for these athletes to come into our system. So as Emma has mentioned, it's really important for us to be able to understand the impairment and health condition and whether those athletes are eligible for Paralympic sport. And for a lot of people, even myself, I have a very good knowledge of swimming, but when it comes to some of the other sports that athletes might be eligible for, I'm very much learning and continuing to grow in what that means. So for someone that has no experience in Paralympic sport, we can recognise how, I guess, complex and how intimidating that might be. And part of our goal is really trying to simplify that opportunity for some of our athletes. So for athletes coming along to one of our testing days, it's designed to be able to create a really fun, a really engaging, and a really enjoyable opportunity for some of our athletes. And so some of the photos that you can see are some of the diverse range of athletes that have come to our testing. We find that the athletes have a really, really positive experience being a part of a group of athletes, or people that have never ever connected to sport before, being in a really fun and engaging space, and being around sometimes in different impairments for the very first time. And I think it's one of those really powerful aspects of sport. And we'd always talk about the saying, you can't be what you can't see. And for some of these athletes, they connect into schools, they connect into their communities, and they never ever see someone that has a similar impairment type to them. And so part of these days is creating those opportunities where these athletes start to really see what other opportunities may be out there for them. So as I mentioned, we do have some performance tests. We're capturing data to try and help inform how do we talent ID some of these para athletes. But what we also do is we spend about 15 minutes with each athlete, with our physiotherapist, taking down some information about those athletes. So when the athlete leaves our testing day, they have some of their personal performance results from the tests that they've carried out, but they also receive a list of all the sports that they're tentatively eligible for. We won't guarantee them eligibility just around the classification components, but we have a very good educated guess as to what sports they're going to be eligible for. And I know for athletes like myself, I definitely love swimming. I love the opportunities it created for me, but I didn't realise that I was eligible for 8 other Paralympic sports, which could have opened up an entirely different opportunity of passion and interest. And for a lot of these athletes that may be young or have recently acquired their impairment type, they may not know of those other sporting opportunities. And we're seeing some really great opportunities with some of those athletes. I'll quickly highlight Stephen, who's in the blue shirt. Stephen has come to us having basically no connection to sport at all growing up. But a couple of years ago, he was in a motor vehicle accident and lost his leg from just below the knee. We've since had him come along to our testing session, showed some really great promise. We've connected him to athletics, and in the first session that he did on the athletics field for shot put, the coach just said, hey, this is generally how you throw a shot put, give it a go, see how far you can throw. In his very first throw, he threw the qualifying standard for the Commonwealth Games for his Paralympic eligible sport for the Commonwealth Games that are next year. And so although he needs to do that throw at a competition, to see that there's some talent that is just hiding within our community. We really want to be able to tap into any potential athlete, whether they're deemed to be eligible or maybe we don't know whether they're eligible yet. Part of these days is about finding these athletes and informing their choice as to what they have available to them. Next slide, please, Emma. I'm going to jump through a couple because I know Emma does need to run at 1:45, and mindful of everybody else's time as well. The athlete pathway for us is really, really simple, and we want to be able to connect those athletes into the sport. The biggest thing for us is that our biggest mechanism is those referral of athletes and they're entering through their U32 testing. Once they move through our system, we can accelerate their development in that big rocket ship that can launch them into the sporting system as it is. Thank you, Emma. One thing I will highlight, and probably the reason why the para unit is so influential, is that we're not taking away from mainstream development of athletes, but we recognise that the para unit is offering support that probably goes above and beyond what other athletes currently receive at a similar level in mainstream sport. This is because, as Emma's mentioned, we want to try and get athletes into the sports as quickly as possible and increase their performance opportunities. So we're really accelerating that development to try and get more athletes to try and fill out that inverted funnel that we do have. So these are some of the offerings that we do have in the Queensland Academy of Sport's para unit. But we are super mindful that sport play a really powerful piece in this model as well. Thank you, Emma. Emma, did you want to say anything with regards to this final part? Because you are the star in both of these photos.
I think it was just to highlight that we're really trying to get out into the community, and I guess this webinar is part of that as well, and connecting with sport and recreation sectors. But we're also the allied health, disability providers, education and clubs will be the base of where we find this raw talent. So any ways that we can utilise the knowledge and education that we've got to help facilitate these conversations is really important.